where the damned are never alone. Return to Ridgefield, where the echoes creak, secrets in the void, where the cursed souls weep, 13 floors reborn. Hear the nexus tune, instilling steps, you'll seal your doom.
Ridgefield.
The nexus calls once more.
In the forgotten depths beneath Ridgefield, something has been waiting. A prison carved from stone and silence, where the light from above has never reached. Tonight we descend into the prison below. What was locked away down here was never meant to be found. Stay with me, if you dare. Every story has a foundation. Not the beginning you see on the surface, not the opening chapter or the first terrible night, but the bedrock beneath it all, the buried thing that everything else was built to conceal. In Ridgefield, that foundation is stone and iron, and the screams of men who went into the earth and did not come back as men. Skeleton Prison. It does not appear on any modern map. No historical society has claimed it. No documentary crew has filmed its corridor. There's a reason for this. Some places resist being known. They resist being found. They resist, most of all, being understood. John Smith has descended into the only place in Ridgefield deeper than the hospital, deeper than the curse, deeper than the choices that have brought him here. He goes not as a hero, not even as a man with a plan. He goes because the Nexus demands it, and because somewhere in that ancient dark, the last piece of the truth wants to be pried from the stone. Welcome, dear listeners, to the place that started everything. Tonight, we descend into the prison below. The fissure from floor 12 opened onto a staircase that the architectural plans Mike sent me couldn't account for, because whoever designed Sterling Hospital's 13 floors above had deliberately omitted what lay beneath. Not on paper, not in any official record. But the stairs were there, carved from native rock, older than the hospital by decades, worn smooth by the passage of countless feet in both directions. Feet going down willingly in the beginning. Later, by feet being dragged. The stone had absorbed all of it. You could feel it through the soles of your boots, a faint vibration, rhythmic and low, like a pulse. The earth itself had a heartbeat down here, and it wasn't comforting. Emma was at my left shoulder, her flashlight cutting through the dark ahead of mine, beams crossing and recrossing as we descended. Neither of us had spoken since floor 12. There wasn't much to say. Thorne's betrayal, Kate's transformation, the burning wards above, all of it felt strangely distant already, like events from another person's life. Prison had that effect. The moment you crossed into its atmosphere, the moment the temperature dropped those final degrees and the stone closed in, and the sound of the hospital above disappeared entirely. Everything that had happened before became prelude. The real story was down here. The prison opened before us like a womb. That's the only word for it. Not a room, not a complex, a womb. A space that shouldn't exist, gouged into the earth. Roof rough-hewn and massive, its ceiling lost somewhere above in a darkness that the flashlight beams couldn't reach. Torches and iron brackets line the stone walls, unlit but intact, their pitch heads black and dry. I thumbed my lighter, the old one from my original survival kit, scratched and dented, a relic from the first Ridgefield ordeal. I touched the flame to the nearest torch. It caught instantly. Too fast, as if it had been waiting. In the sudden bloom of orange light, the full scale of the place revealed itself. Skeleton Prison had been built to hold approximately 200 prisoners at its height, according to Warden Myers' journals. That number was deceptive. Cells that lined the cavern walls were not individual rooms in any conventional sense. They were carved alcoves, some barely large enough for a man to lie flat, sealed with iron doors so old the rust had fused the hinges into solid masses of orange-brown corrosion. The doors would never open again. Most of them, I realized as I moved forward with the torch, didn't need to. The prisoners were still inside. Not as ghosts. Not yet. As impressions. As outlines of suffering so deep and sustained that the rock itself had recorded. The way a needle records sound onto vinyl. Walls remembered, and in this place the walls played back. The riot happened here, Emma said softly, her voice swallowed by the cavern almost as soon as it left her mouth. She was standing before a section of wall where the stone had been worked differently. Smoother, carved with deliberate intention rather than the rough excavation of the rest. In the torchlight, I could see why. It was a mural, not painted, carved in bas relief, images pressed into the rock with tools that must have taken years of patient, fervent work. It depicted the riot in meticulous detail, prisoners breaking from their alcoves, wardens with rifles and torches, and in the center, the eye of it all, the shape on the floor. A circular depression in the stone, its edges carved with the same runework I'd seen on the hospital map, on Myers' journal pages, on the walls of every floor we'd descended through. The nexus. Here, this was where it had started. Not in the hospital above, here in this cavern, in this prison, in the floor of the world itself. I crouched at the edge of the carving, torch held close. Myers' journal had described the moment of the riot's true cause in language so oblique I had half dismissed it as a metaphor. The prisoners found the voice in the floor, and they listened when they should not have listened, and they answered when they should not have answered. Standing here now, I understood it wasn't metaphor at all. Something beneath the floor, at the deepest level of a prison built over an existing void, had spoken to men driven to the edge of madness by confinement and mistreatment, and those men with nothing left to lose had answered back. The riot was the first conversation. Everything since had been the ongoing dialogue. My bass hummed against my back without me touching it. Not the aggressive dissonance of floor 11, or the shattering resonance of mid-floors. Something different. A sympathetic vibration, strings tuning themselves to a frequency already present in the air. And then noticed. Don't, she said, a word that contained volume. I stood slowly, backing away from the depression. I wasn't going to. But something in my voice didn't fully convince either. We moved deeper into the complex, lighting torches as we went. A skeleton prison revealed its layers, a central nave of cells flanked by two side passages that curved away into the dark. The blueprints Mike had found showed them meeting again further on, forming a rough oval shape, intentional architecture rather than the organic sprawl I'd expected. The oval enclosed something. The center of skeleton prison was not a courtyard or a common room. It was a pit. Circular, roughly 4 meters across, its edges dressed stone, its depth unclear in the torchlight. We stood at its rim and looked down, and the torchlight couldn't find the bottom. Myers' journal, I said, pulling it from my pack and thumbing to a page I marked with a strip torn from Kate's diary. He calls this the confession pit. Says the wardens used it for interrogation. But the language gets strange when he describes it. Says the pit asks for its own questions after a while. The prisoners brought here for interrogation began answering questions that hadn't been asked yet. Confessions to things that hadn't happened yet. Describing events that occurred weeks later with perfect accuracy. I looked up at Emma. She was staring into the pit with the expression of someone who has stopped being surprised by impossible things and has moved into a quiet, sustained dread that is somehow worse. Precognition, she said flatly, forced by exposure to the nexus. This pit is a direct aperture to it. Whatever's down there is close enough to the surface here that it rewrites the relationship between time and consciousness. I became aware, as we stood at the pit's edge, that we were not alone in the way we had been not alone in the hospital above. The ghosts of Skeleton Prison were different from those of Sterling Spores. They were less interested in chasing or frightening. They gathered at the edges of the torchlight, prisoner shapes, indistinct, wearing clothes of 1890s and early 1900s, their faces showing the blankness of men who had been in the pit's proximity for too long. They didn't approach, they watched. And they waited with the patient certainty of people who already knew how the story ends. We need Kate, Emma said, and the words hit like cold water. I know that's not what either of us wants to deal with right now, but the diary entries from 4-6, the complete ones, they're clear. Nexus designated her as the anchor point. Her transformation gives her access to the prison's lair that we can't reach. She's the key to the 4 paths. Without her, we can't close the pit. We can't break the cycle. We can't even understand what the endings mean. She paused. And she was here before us. Look. On the floor near the pit's eastern edge lay a page from Kate's diary. Torn and left deliberately. I recognized the handwriting even in the torchlight, even through the transformation's effect. The ink was darker than it should have been, organic. The entry was dated not with a calendar date, but with a depth measurement. 47 meters. I've been here longer than you realize. The pit showed me everything. All 4 paths, all 4 versions of what you'll choose when you finally arrive. I want you to know, John, whatever path you walk, I understood. I understand, but understanding and forgiving aren't the same thing. Come to the center, ring the bass. The nexus speaks in frequencies. You always knew that. That's why I chose a musician. The entry ended there. I read it twice, folded it carefully, put it in my pocket next to Myers' journal, said nothing for a long time. What's in the side passages? Emma asked, not because she necessarily wanted to know, but because standing at the pit's edge, writing love letters from a transformed nexus anchor was not a sustainable strategy. We split the difference. She took the western passage. I took the eastern, agreeing to meet back at the pit in 20 minutes. I moved through the eastern tunnel with my torch and my knife in the increasing certainty that Kate's note had been both completely sincere and very carefully constructed to lead me exactly where she wanted me. The eastern passage was the archive. I don't know what I'd expected. More cells, more carved walls, more of the physical horror of confinement. What I found instead was evidence of mind working desperately against the tide. Warden Myers, in the years following the 1905 riot, and before his death in 1911, had used the Eastern Passage as a research station. Crude wooden shelves lining the stone walls, crates of documents, some decayed beyond recovery, others preserved in the dry, cold air with miraculous fidelity. Star charts, that mapped against the topology of the prison, the curves of its oval walls, acoustic diagrams showing the resonance patterns of the cavern at different frequencies. And most crucially, a series of clay tablets, each roughly the size of a dinner plate, each inscribed with the rune system I'd seen throughout the complex, but rendered here in exhaustive detail, with notes in Myers' handwriting translating each symbol's function. I worked quickly, photographing everything with my phone. Signal still dead. but the camera still worked. Myers had understood the nexus with sophistication that his public journals, the ones that had filtered into historical records, deliberately obscured. He knew it wasn't malevolent in the way that the word implies agenda. It was hungry in the way that a vacuum is hungry. It didn't want to consume. It simply was a void, and voids fill. The human minds around it, the prisoners, the wardens, eventually the town itself, were the material it used to fill itself. Their guilt and fears and unresolved traumas pulled in and compressed into the entities we faced throughout the hospital above. Each ghost was a debt unpaid. Each horror was a regret crystallized. The Nexus wasn't evil, it was the accumulated consequence of human choices made in darkness, and it simply could not stop growing as long as humans kept making it. Myers had identified 4 methods of resolution. 4, not 1. This was the crucial piece I'd been missing. The reason the endings had always been described as 4 paths rather than a single solution. Because the Nexus was not a problem with a solution. It was a mirror, and what you did with the mirror depended entirely on what you needed to see. The 4 resolutions as Myers had documented them. The first, mercy. Acknowledge every debt without assigning blame. Accept the Nexus as the consequence of collective human failure and absorb it, not destroy it, but integrate it, become its guardian, carry the weight of Ridgefield's accumulated guilt so that it stops growing. The Nexus doesn't close, it heals, slowly, with tending. The Guardian does not get to leave. This was Thorne's path, corrupted by his desire for controlling him to something predatory, done with genuine selflessness. It was the most sustainable resolution. Done wrong, it created exactly what Thorne had become. The second, vengeance. Not the blind rage that Episode 6 had explored, but structured, surgical accountability. Return each crystallized guilt to its origin point. Force each entity back to the Nexus to confront the specific choice that created it. Violent, painful, and temporary. The Nexus closes for a generation, perhaps 2. Then, because humans keep making choices in darkness, it begins again. Vengeance is real, it simply doesn't last. The third, denial. The most seductive option. Walk away. Convince yourself the Nexus is sealed, that Ridgefield is contained, that the spreading anomalies will stop on their own. They won't. Denial purchases time at the cost of scale. The next opening is always larger. The next Ridgefield affects not a town, but a region. Not a region, but potentially more. Myers had marked this option with a single word in darker ink. Temptation. The fourth, truth. Tell it. All of it. To everyone. Document the Nexus, the prison, the curse, the entities, the experiments. Make it known, not as a horror tourism or supernatural spectacle, but as the literal consequence of what the town of Ridgefield did to its most vulnerable people. The miners it exploited, the prisoners it buried, the afflicted it institutionalized rather than helped. The Nexus feeds on secrets, truth starves it. Not quickly, not cleanly, but permanently, if the truth is total. Emma was back at the pit before me, breathing hard, eyes wide with something that wasn't quite fear, and wasn't quite excitement, but occupying the volatile space between them. Western Passage, she said without preamble. You need to hear this. Myers didn't work alone down here. She opened her notebook, where she'd been sketching and writing since we split. There were others. After the riot, a small group, 3 survivors, prisoners who hadn't broken under the Nexus exposure, could maintain enough of themselves to be useful. Myers kept them down here voluntarily, informal researchers. They were the ones who first mapped the 4 resolutions. He credited them in the Western Passage in an inscription that's still readable. One of them, a prisoner named Holt, in for counterfeiting, completely sane and sharp as a blade, left his own notes separate from Myers. Holt's conclusion was different from Myers. He thought there was a 5th option. He paused. Myers had crossed it out, but I can still read it. Holt called it synthesis. All 4 paths at once. Not one person walking one resolution, but a group, each taking a different path simultaneously. 4 resolutions creating a combined effect that none of them could achieve alone. He thought it might close the Nexus permanently. Not for a generation, permanently. Another pause. Myers crossed it out because it requires someone at the center of the pit, someone who already passed through the nexus, someone who wasn't fully human anymore. Kate's voice came from below the pit's rim. Not from the pit itself, from the stone edge, where her hands appeared first, gripping the dressed stone, and then her face, rising from the darkness that should have had anything to stand on. Her form was hybrid still, the entity elements visible in the torchlight, the slight iridescence of her skin, the shadows around her eyes that were deeper than shadows should be, the way she moved, the fluid wrongness, too smooth, gravity making suggestions rather than demands. But her voice was hers, just hers. Whatever the transformation had done to her, it had not touched the specific frequency of Kate Myers' voice. "I've been reading over your shoulder," she said. "From the pit side. I've been in there, in the nexus itself, for longer than the timeline you understand. Time doesn't work in there the way it does up here." She pulled herself fully over the pit's edge and stood before us, and the ghost shapes backed away just slightly, and something that looked like deference. Holt was right. Myers crossed it out because he was afraid. He was always afraid of the fifth option, because the fifth option requires trust between people in a place specifically designed to destroy trust. He looked at me. "It requires a musician who understands that music is just organized frequency, and that the nexus speaks in frequency, and the bass guitar tuned to the right resonance can act as a conductor between the four human resolutions if all four are chosen simultaneously by people who actually mean them." He looked at Emma. "And it requires a skeptic who has stopped being skeptical because the frequency only works if there's no resonance from disbelief, or no resistance from disbelief." She reached into her coat, still the same coat from the city, and possibly intact, and produced three objects: the rusted warden's key from the scavenger hunt items, a shard of mirror from floor one's corridor, and a clay tablet identical to the ones from the eastern passage. "I've been preparing for this before you arrived. Since before I arrived the first time. The pit showed me." Pause. "The question is whether you trust me enough to try." Emma and I looked at each other across the pit. The ghost shapes had formed a loose ring around us now, prisoner silhouettes standing at attention in the torchlight, their faces turned towards the pit's center. They were waiting too. They'd been waiting since 1905, since before that, since whatever choice and whatever darkness had first made this place necessary. "Walk me through the fifth option," I said. "Exactly. Every step. If any of it sounds like you manipulated us towards a predetermined outcome, I will know, because I know you, Kate. Even like this, maybe especially like this." Something shifted in her expression. Not the inhuman fluidity, but something underneath it. Something that has survived the transformations intact. "That," she said quietly, "is the most accurate thing you've said since you got back to Ridgefield. You're right that I know the outcome. I saw it in the pit. And knowing the outcome and manipulating you towards it are different things. The pit showed me all four of the single paths and the fifth. The fourth single paths each create something real. The fifth creates something that can't be undone. I'm not going to tell you which to choose. That's the whole point. The fifth option only works if every person in it makes a genuinely free choice." She sets the three objects at the edge of the pit. "I can tell you the mechanism. The choice is yours." She explained the mechanism for what felt like an hour, her voice steady and clear in the underground dark. The torches burning lower as the pit depleted, needed new ones lit from old ones in a relay that kept the light alive. The fifth option required that Holt had called simultaneous authentic intention, not performed conviction, but actual choice, felt and meant in the moment of making it. The bass, tuned to the pit's bass frequency, would act as a carrier wave for the combined intention, broadcasting it into the nexus through the aperture in the floor. Kate, as the anchor, would translate, her hybrid state making her a conduit between the human frequency of intention and the non-human frequency of the nexus itself. The runes on the clay table were the structured diagram. Score, essentially, for an instrument that had to be made of human choice rather than of wood and steel. When she finished, we were quiet for a long time. The prison breathed around us. I have a question, Emma said finally. Not a skeptical one, a genuine one. What happens to you after, if this works? Kate's expression didn't change exactly, but something in the quality of the stillness around her shifted. The anchor dissolves, she said. The Nexus doesn't need a Kate Myers-shaped anchor anymore. Whether I come back as myself, or come back as something in between, or don't come back at all, the pit didn't show me that. That's the one thing it kept opaque. Pause. Which is either reassuring, because it means it's generally undetermined, or deeply ominous, depending on your perspective. He almost smiled. I've been living in the Nexus long enough that I find it reassuring. You may feel differently. I unslung the base from my back and held it from the neck, feeling the weight of it. Familiar as a heartbeat after 20 years. Silver String had gone through fire and confrontation and the resonant assault of half a dozen Nexus accounts. That should have snapped by now. They were perfect. I thought about what Kate had said about the Nexus choosing a musician, and for the first time since Ridgefield had pulled me back, that framing didn't feel like flattery or manipulation. It felt like accurate taxonomy. I played instruments for a living because organized frequency had always made more sense to me than organized language. I understood pitch before I understood grammar. Music was the way I had always made sense of a world that frequently refused to make sense through any other lens. The Nexus spoke of frequency. Maybe it had always been trying to tell me something, in the language I was most equipped to hear. Alright, I said, and then, because it seemed like the moment required more than tactical agreement, for the record, whatever we're about to do, whatever happens after, the first Ridgefield, the album, coming back, none of it. The choice I'd do differently is not calling Kate back when she first went quiet, before the trip, or any of this. I looked at her hybrid face in the torchlight. That's the first unresolved debt, just so you know. Something in her had been braced against the possibility of this conversation let go. I know, she said. Pitt showed me that too. A beat. It also showed me that you would say it, which is why I decided the fifth option was worth trusting you with it. I picked up the clay tablet and the key and the mirror shard and arranged them at the pit's rim in the pattern the rune diagrams indicated. Emma, when the frequency starts, the skepticism reflex will kick in. That's okay. Don't fight it directly, that creates resistance. Instead, focus on something you know is empirically true. Hold one solid fact in your mind like an anchor point. Let the truth of the fact carry you through the disbelief. Emma nodded slowly. I know what fact I'll use, she said. I've been here. That's empirical. Whatever explanation I assign to it, the fact of being here is not negotiable. Kate looked at her with something I could only read as respect. That's exactly right. She stepped back from the pit's edge to stand at its center, aperture directly below her feet. When you're ready. I played the first note. The cavern answered. And in that moment, in the space between the first note and whatever came next, I understood what the Nexus actually was. Not a terror, not a void, not a hunger. It was a recorder. An archive like the Eastern Passage, but older and vaster and more fundamental. A record of every choice made in darkness, every unacknowledged debt, every truth suppressed in favor of comfort. It had been filling since the first human chose to do harm and called it something else. Ridgefield was one of its access points. Not the only one, not even the largest. Just the one that had found us because we were the ones willing to go down far enough to listen. The four resolutions weren't competing strategies. They were the four instruments of accord: mercy, vengeance, denial, truth. All four had a sound at once because all four were real. All four were true. The solution to accumulated human darkness was not to pick up one response to it and apply it perfectly. It was to hold all of the real responses simultaneously and mean them, fully, without the luxury of choosing which feelings were acceptable to have. I played, Emma held her fact, Kate translated, the prison listened. And from somewhere below, from somewhere deeper than the pit, deeper than the prison, Deeper than the Earth's memory of what humans had done here, something vast and old and incomprehensibly patient began, very slowly, for what might have been the first time, to exhale. The pit asked its own questions. That's what Myers wrote, and he was right. He just didn't finish the thought. The pit asks its own questions, and the ones it asks most persistently are the ones you came in carrying without realizing. Mine was, does knowing the outcome of the story make your choices in it less real? I spent however long the Nexus measures time in there looking at all four paths, all the branching versions, all the possible John and Emmas, and versions of this resolution. And the answer it finally showed me is no. Knowing what happens doesn't make the moment of choosing it less true. You are still the person you chose. Your choice is still the choice. The outcome doesn't own it. You do. That's what the Nexus couldn't process. That's what the fifth option does to it. It shows the Nexus that human choices aren't debts to be collected. They're just what people do in the dark, with what they have, for reasons that are more complicated than the guilt they leave behind. Some of those choices are terrible. They are still the choices. The Nexus can archive them. It cannot define them. We are not our worst moments. Ridgefield is not its worst century. And I am not just an anchor. A pause. Breath. I think I'm going to be very cold when we get back above ground. For the record, the fact I held was this. Water flows downhill. It's empirically true everywhere on Earth, in every condition humans have tested. It's so reliable it's almost boring. It's standing at the edge of the Nexus aperture in a prison that physics forgot, with a musician playing chords through a trans-dimensional archive while a partially transformed woman channeled human intention into non-human frequency, holding on to the fact that water flows downhill was the most stabilizing thing I'd ever done. The mundane is the anchor. Remember that. When the impossible closes in, the mundane is the anchor. Gravity still works, water still falls, and here we are in a place that should be impossible, and the impossible is receding, and gravity is about to have us climbing stairs. I will take that. Pause. I'm also going to need to debrief with about 17 different agencies when I get back to the surface, and I'm not a single one of them is going to believe a word of this, and I find, standing here, that I genuinely do not care. The prison was different on the way back. Lighter. Not in the literal sense. The torches burned the same. The dark above the cavern ceiling was the same, but the weight of it had shifted. The ghost shapes were gone, not dramatically, not in any flash of light or dissolving chorus. They were simply, quietly, not there anymore. The alcove cells had stopped breathing. The chains hung still without that faint, draft-driven movement. Myers' archive in the Eastern Passage would need to be properly documented, preserved, shared. Fourth Resolution's work, truth-telling, was going to take years, probably decades. There were names in those records, real names, families still in Ridgefield, or traces of families, people who deserved to know what had been done to their ancestors and what had grown from it. That was the work that would keep the Nexus from refilling. Not the frequency, not the moment in the pit, but the ongoing, unglamorous labor of making the hidden visible, the telling of true things in public, the acknowledgement of debt without the demand for absolution. We climbed. The stairs were the same stairs we descended. Stone was the same stone. But the pulse I'd felt through my boots was down, going down was gone, just rock now. Just the earth, doing what earth does, holding up the weight of everything built on top of it, saying nothing about what it has witnessed. The hospital waited above, Ridgefield waited beyond that. The world spreading out from there with its own confessions unspoken, and its own pit of apertures forming in darkness where people choose to look away. One thing at a time. We climb towards the light. Below the asylum, below the town, below the hill and the century of fog, and the accumulated weight of what people do to each other in the name of progress and order and the fear of what they don't understand. Below all of it, three people stood at the edge of an aperture into the collected consciousness of the consequence of human choice, and they chose all four things at once, imperfectly. with full knowledge that they were imperfect, and the vast, old, patient thing in the dark heard the frequency of genuine intention, and it did what it had always been capable of doing. If anyone had thought to try, it listened back. The work is not done. It won't be done in one episode, or one season, or one town's worth of reckoning. But the archive is no longer filling. The recorder has stopped running. And in Ridgefield tonight, for the first time in 130 years, the fog is thinning. Just at the edges, just enough to see the street signs. Whether that's enough, whether the truth-telling holds, whether the next generation of choices tips the balance back, that, dear listeners, is not a horror story anymore. That is a question for morning. Tune in for the finale, if the dawn holds.